The chair calls the Education Finance Committee meeting to order for Tuesday, January 21st, 2025. So welcome, everyone, and the committee assistant will note the roll, and we do have a quorum present. Quorum is present. So first of all, thank you, everyone. We're going to do an overview today. Just a quick reminder to the members, speak into the microphone, and then we'll have you introduce yourself and make sure you put your name on, so we have that for the record. So members, this is our first committee hearing for 2025, and we're just going to start with some organizational business, including members and staff introductions. So I think what I'll do is I'll start with Representative Reimer, if that's okay. And we'll just come around and then we'll go to the staff. So Representative Reimer, if you could introduce yourself, your district, and a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Max Reimer, representing 28B, Chisago County. When I'm not representing the district, I own a digital marketing agency. We serve over 300 real estate clients across the country. Also own a mortgage company, but have 3 kids, and my wife and I live in North Branch, Minnesota.
And Representative Reimer, what's a school district in your area?
Chisago Lakes is in my area, along with the North Branch School District.
Very good. Representative Roach.
Good afternoon, thanks for having me. Representative Roach, I'm District 58B, small business owner-operator. Got 3 children, and so when I'm not here representing the people of 58B, you'll find me at a school activity or coaching youth football and one of the activities my kids have. Yeah, so I'm just excited to be here.
Farmington School District?
Yes, Farmington School District.
And just a quick side note, I didn't invite you, so thanks for that little, thanks for being here, but it was your district that sent you, so welcome to the committee. Representative Mueller.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Representative Patricia Mueller, third term representing District 23B. Down in Austin, Minnesota, I represent school districts of Austin, Lisle, Grand Meadow, Blooming Prairie, Hayfield, sort of, even though I share that with Representative Quam, and also Southland. And was a teacher for 20 years, been married to my husband for almost 21 years, and we have 2 dogs named Lincoln and Reagan.
And outside of this, Representative Mueller, you have another role that you play in a committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm also the Vice Chair of Education Policy.
Very well. Thanks for being here. Representative DePel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Tom DePel, and I live in Cottage Grove. We also cover the Hastings School District area, which is 200. And then I also am part of the 833 South Washington County School District area. I'm the board chair of a classical school in Woodbury, which is just north of my district. Been married to my wife for 17 years. We got 6 kids, and excited to serve here.
Very well. Welcome to the committee. Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nice to be here again. And I'm Peggy Bennett. I live in Albert Lee, represent 23A, partner district to Representative Mueller. And I'm a former teacher of 33 years, also the chair of education policy. The district's the largest school district in my area is the Albert Lee area schools, but also Glenville Emmons resides in my district. Alden Conger, the United South Central, which is over in Wells, and New Richland, Heartland, Ellendale, Geneva School District. So quite a few of them, and it's an honor to serve here. Thank you.
Welcome to the committee. Representative Bakeberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Ben Bakeberg. I have the privilege to represent 54B, which is the school districts of Jordan, Prior Lake, Shakopee. Southwest Metro Intermediate District is also in my district, and then obviously we have a number of private schools and homeschool communities as well. I'm currently working as a middle school principal when I'm not here. So obviously education, finance, and policy is near and dear to my heart, because what we talk about here, I actually have to implement when I go back to school. So it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to serve as the vice chair.
And Representative Bakeberg, have the honor of serving as the vice chair in this capacity. And so Representative Bakeberg, you have the unique position of when you say sticking it to the man, you'll be sticking it to yourself with the policy, won't you?
That's one way to look at it.
So Ron Creech, I serve the district of 10A, centrally located Morrison County, Little Falls. Have been an educator, have run online school, and now I'm involved with online marketing, aviation, so kind of an eclectic life that I have. Little Falls would be the school district that is closest, but everywhere from Royalton to Piers to Aiken, Onamia, and then lots of other Pillager, a lot of schools that I've worked with. So that is the area that I serve, and Representative Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Walter Hudson from District 30A, half of Otsego, St. Michael, Albertville, Hanover, and Rockford Township. Have St. Michael, Albertville schools, a little bit of Elk River School District, and I believe a tiny slice of Rockford schools as well. In fact, I know that to be the case because I just visited them not too long ago. Grew up in Cottage Grove, graduated Park Senior High, go Wolfpack. So we got that little cross-table, cross-district connection there. 2 kids who are in the St. Michael, Albertville schools. 12 years of familiarity with the financial straits that my school district has been in. Got involved in paying attention to that long before I was elected to office. Served 7 years on the Albertville City Council. So very familiar territory for me and looking forward to making a difference.
Very good. Welcome to the committee, Representative Hudson. Representative Knudsen.
Thank you, Chair. Krista Knudsen, I represent House District 5A, which includes everything from Brainerd, Minnesota, all the way to Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, the counties of Cass, Hubbard, Wadena, and Becker. There are, I believe, 16 school districts in my House District, so I'm not going to be able to name them all. But some of them are Park Rapids, Brainerd, Frazee, Vergas, Monaga, quite a few. So I'm happy to be here and hope we can make a difference this year. So thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Representative Knudsen. And Representative Quam.
Dwayne Quam, 24A, Olive Dodge, part of Olmsted, so part of Rochester. Blooming Prairie, Byron, which is the second lowest per pupil funded on the runs that are in our packs. Walter has the lowest per pupil funded. Hayfield, Casa Manorville, Pine Island, which is fifth lowest per pupil funded. Rochester, Stewartville, and I was also on the ZED governing board, which you got several multiple school districts working together because they don't have the critical mass for special ed, and some of you can't hire 0.3 of a sociologist or psychologist, et cetera, that you might need. So that experience of cooperation, and I've interacted and been involved with over 3 dozen schools, some of them with corporate programs, mentoring, tutoring, and community activities. 8th term, and when I'm not in the legislature, I have had titles of engineer, scientist, and technical program manager. And I did serve on the Byron School Board, which had a huge hit from the mandates of about $2 million. They, and other school districts in my area hit by that. So I'm very interested in how we handle that.
And Representative Quam, you also have a committee.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have the Government Operations and Election Finance Committee.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the committee. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to the staff. If it's okay, we'll start with the nonpartisan first. Mr. Strom, Ms. Para, and Ms. Beckel. So I'll let you do your introductions.
Thank you, Chair Krisha. My name is Tim Strom. I work
Can you say
for-
that again, Mr. Strom? I'm kidding. That was great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Tim Strom, and I work for the Minnesota House of Representatives Research Department. We're the nonpartisan office that provides bill drafting and for this committee, certain kinds of financial work for you. We'll do bill summaries, all that kind of thing. We'll work closely with our colleagues in the fiscal department as well. This is my 42nd year here at the legislature, and I'm, as always, privileged to serve the House and hope to do so again this year. Other than that, I think that's maybe enough from me, but look forward to a productive year with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Solveig Beckel, House Fiscal Analysis Department. We are also a nonpartisan department. We serve all 134 members of the House, and our job is to provide the spreadsheets. Mr. Strom, in his role, does provide the district-run spreadsheets and a variety of other spreadsheets as the Education Finance Analyst for Minnesota House Research, but I'll be providing mostly the state-level spreadsheets for you. And I've been with the House for about 6 years, so starting my 7th session now.
Thank you. Ms. Para.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Christina Para from Nonpartisan House Research. So I work with Mr. Strom in House Research on bill drafting, bill summaries, any kind of research you need in education policy. So I will not be providing you any spreadsheets, but happy to work with you all.
Very good. And of course, lots of accolades will be shared for your team as we go through this, but just appreciate everything you all do. So thank you to the great work. So let's go to partisan staff. If we could, I'll start with, we'll just start from my left and go around.
I'm Janelle Bulk. I'm the committee legislative assistant. I've been with the House for 10 years and in state government for 20. Happy to be here.
Jody Withers, I'm the committee administrator. I've been with the House Republican Caucus since 2011.
Jacob Cowan, I'm the partisan researcher, and this is my 3rd year with the House.
Very good. And my early thanks to the staff as well, as we work through this. Having all of that information available and accurate is a great help. So let's just do a quick review, members. So in your folders, you have a copy of the draft committee rules and procedures. If you want to take those out, I'll give you just a second to find those. And then while you're looking, pulling those out, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things. For the benefit of the public, these are public hearings. We'll be meeting at our scheduled time, and I'll make it a point to always schedule or meet on time. If you need to submit a written request for a bill hearing to the committee legislative assistant and the committee administrator. So if you'd like a bill heard, make sure you send a written request to the team. When you have bills before the committee, amendments will be due by noon, the business day prior to the meeting. So usually Mondays and Wednesdays with testifiers and committee handouts due by 2 o'clock, the same business day. And if you have any questions, just make sure you ask. And we want to make sure we get that done and you don't get caught up in some technicality. And then you'll find a save file in the committee folder. If there's documents that you wish to save for future reference, please place those in the save file. These folders will travel with us and they'll come back and forth. And those documents will always be left for you. Anything left out will be recycled. So with that, any questions, first of all? All right. Well, members, let's move to the nonpartisan staff. So I anticipate today and then probably the next meeting will be your show. So with that, let's go ahead and start a general overview and the November numbers, and then we'll be looking for the updated February forecast as that comes up. So at that, Mr. Strom, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Beckel and I will walk through a PowerPoint presentation with you. We want to focus on a couple of things today. We want to make sure that we set a little bit of the stage for you about what the overall state budget looks like. But we primarily want to dig in on how the resources that Ms. Beckel prepares, the aid and levy tracking sheets, can be read, what information they show you, and give you a sense of how those sheets are going to be useful as you go forward in your budgeting process this year. In addition, depending on time, either today or starting at our next meeting, we'll talk about the district-by-district printouts and show you how to read those and discuss what kinds of information can go on a district-by-district printout and how to use that information to understand the proposed legislative changes that the governor and this committee will be making.
And Mr. Strom, just a quick procedural thing. Would you like us to hold questions until you're ready to take a breath, or would you rather have the questions come as you're presenting?
Mr. Chair, Ms. Beckel may feel differently, but I think it's most helpful to ask questions as they arise. I think we've got more materials than we're going to cover in the presentation, and Part of it is to make sure that you all get to the level you want to be, but if there are specific issues you want to dig into, best probably to do them at that point in time.
Okay, and so members, if you have a question specifically on something you're hearing from Mr. Strom, Ms. Beckel, or Ms. Parrott, just let Janelle know. If it's something that you want towards the end, you can somehow indicate that as well. So, Mr. Strom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the PowerPoint is in your packet, as well as the documents that Ms. Beckel's prepared. They'll also be on the screen. At times, the print on the screen will get a little small for you, so you may want to look at your written copies for the sake of your eyes. What we'd like to do today is talk a little about the general fund process, the budget surplus, or the revenue, the spending, the surplus that's projected for the coming biennium and the deficit for the following. And then we'll talk about school district revenue and spend most of the time on bullet 5 there today about statewide, on the state aid system and the statewide tracking of each of the state aid areas assigned to this committee. Then we'll dig into the property taxes as well, talk about school district property taxes, including the statewide tracking. And then we'll start looking at district by district revenue, and we've got 3 types of sample printouts for you in the packets that we'll use that'll talk about general education revenue, special education funding, and then how to measure changes with and without inflation built in the baseline. So with that, let's start with a bit of an overview of the state general fund revenue. Minnesota's system, and you've probably heard this elsewhere, but it's probably helpful to repeat for you. Minnesota's general fund budget is estimated 2 times a year through the forecast. There's a November forecast and a February forecast. We refer to state resources primarily as the result of tax receipts. And then we refer to expenditures or spending. So the 2 sides of the ledger for you are going to be the resources. What do you have to spend? And then the second, what are you spending that money on? In the K-12 world, you're focused almost entirely on the state general fund. Some areas of the state budget have special revenue funds, areas like transportation, for example, where that money doesn't go into or out of the state general fund. Instead, it's in a different fund. But in the K-12 area, nearly all of the funding is from the general fund, and we'll focus on that fund in this committee. In terms of the budget documents themselves, the Department of Management and Budget, MMB is its acronym, contains some good sections with historical information on both the forecasts and the budgets. The budget pages will include a narrative for each of the programs in the K-12 area, track the amount of spending in those areas, and then show the governor's recommendations in those areas. The forecast comes out, as I said, twice a year, and that document is the state's best guess of how much tax receipts, how much revenue the state's gonna have, and what the projected spending under baseline provisions are for each of the budget years. Here's a link to the forecast document for you all. That we're currently in fiscal year 25, which is the end of the 24-25 school year. And this year, you as the 2025 legislature will be budgeting for the 26 and 27 years. Those are the years that you'll actually have to appropriate money for. And then you'll also be given targets to deal with the 28 and 29 fiscal years as well. So you'll have a 4-year fiscal window that you'll be looking at, but you'll actually be making appropriations for the first 2 of those years for fiscal years 26 and 27. Again, fiscal year 26 starting July 1st of this year. You've heard much about the state budget already, but I think for this committee's sake, to understand what the governor's recommending and to understand your mission, it's helpful to take a very quick overview of the state general fund budget estimate. There's 3 columns on this chart. The first column is for the years that are just the biennium that's just wrapping up. The middle column is for the years you'll be budgeting for, and the last column is for what we call the tails or the out years for 28, 29. And what the forecast does is it looks at the best guess of where the fund balance and the spending and the revenue will be, to give you a sense of what you're looking at. And you can see that the fund balance in for the biennium that's just ending was $16.5 billion. The state is expected to collect a total of $61.4 billion of taxes, and there's some smaller non-tax revenue, but primarily taxes. In terms of the spending, there's $70.6 million of spending, and not surprising, much of that, $23.9 billion of the spending is for K-12 education. The remainder of the state budget's about 40, of the general fund budget's about $46.8 billion. So if you look to the very bottom then, the second to bottom line shows you that the state has a reserve account and a cash flow account that have $3.5 billion in them. And after the fund balance in, the spending for the current biennium, and the revenue coming in, budgetary balance of $3.7 billion on top of that $3.5 billion is where the state's expected to end the year under the baseline budget, assuming no changes for 24 and 25. As you pull those numbers forward then into fiscal year 26 and 27, the years you're budgeting for, you've got a fund balance coming in of $7.3 billion. Tax revenue and the non-tax revenue is expected to be $63.85 billion. K-12 spending at $25.4 million, and all other general fund spending of $41.6 billion for total spending of $66.98 billion. Assuming that you keep the reserve account and cash flow account at $3.5 billion, that leaves $616 million on the bottom line for the current biennium. So if your budgeting window were to end with this biennium, essentially you'd have $616 million to spend. Coming forward into the tails year, fiscal years 28 and 29, you can see that including the budget reserve and cash flow and the budgetary balance, your starting balance will be $4.1 billion. State tax revenue and non-tax revenue about $67.6 billion. Total spending about $73.4 billion, of which $27 billion is K-12 education. And you can see if you intended to keep $3.5 billion in the budget reserve and cash flow account, that you'll have a negative budget balance. You'll be in the red by $5.1 billion. Now, we don't need to get in, for this committee purpose, we don't need to get into all of the specifics about that. But the best guess right now is for the current biennium, there'll be $616 million positive on the bottom line. And assuming no changes at all, there'll be a minus $5.1 billion on the bottom line for 28 and 29. So very simply stated, there's money to spend this biennium, and there's money that isn't available for spending next biennium. So your decisions are going to involve how to make the budget for 26 and 27, and how also to have a tails budget that's going to balance where you want that to be for 28 and 29. It's a lot of material compressed on this, and your role really is, in this committee, is to look at that K-12 state education aid spending. That's the primary function of this committee. But without this context, I think it's sometimes hard for those decisions to be evaluated. So the budget documents do a much better job of laying this out in detail. But as a quick summary, this is the state of the overall state budget that you're looking at for the next 4 years. If we look at state revenue over time, a chart that may be somewhat helpful to you shows state and local tax revenue over time. And you can see here what the different revenue sources are: the property tax, income tax, sales tax, corporate tax, and all other. And you can see from 1957 forward how those revenue shares of state and local tax revenue have changed over that time period. If we look at one particular year, if we take the current year we're in and we look at the resources available to the state, in the lower left-hand side of this pie chart, you can see that there's a pretty substantial fund balance in, and 28% of the total revenue available this year is coming from the fund balance. The biggest share is the income tax share at, I'm sorry, I skipped a slide there. The individual income tax is 37% of the state budget for the general fund budget. Sales tax about 17%, small amounts for liquor, cigarettes, and gambling. The corporate bank and insurance is about 9% of the total. There's a small statewide property tax that comes to the state, and you can see around the rest of the pie chart as well. So those are the total resources, including the fund balance in for the current year. When we look at where that money is being spent for the current year, you can see that 35%, the biggest share of the state budget, goes to K-12 education at about 35% of that, $35 billion. The next biggest share is health and human services funding, followed by funding for intergovernmental aids, which are primarily local government aids for property tax relief to local governments. Public safety is about 6% of the total state budget. State government and economic development about 7%, higher education about 6%, and you can see some smaller amounts on the left as well. So for the spending for the current year, that's where the current allocation of resources is. When we get to the school funding by source, you can see that that state aid that we talked about, that 35% of the state budget general fund goes to schools and becomes 64% of all school revenue for the current year. The federal government's share for fiscal year 25 is about 8% of the total. Local property taxes are about 20% of the average district's budget. And other local amounts, which include fees and sales and certain school district transfers, are about 7% of the total. About 2/3, as that last pie chart pointed out, about 2/3 of Minnesota's total funding comes from state aid payments. And Ms. Beckle's now going to talk about the state aid tracking sheet and work you through the columns and rows on how to read that state aid tracking worksheet.
Thank you, Mr. Strong. Ms. Beckel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Solveig Beckel, House Fiscal. I'm going to talk through the spreadsheet that has Education Finance, 2024 November forecast, aid appropriation summary in the top left-hand corner, excuse me.
All right, so members, can you say that again, Ms. Beckel, please?
Yes, it is titled Education Finance, 2024 November forecast, aid appropriation summary in the top left-hand corner.
And that's the longer one, right? It's not one of the 11 by 17s?
It is 11 by 17,
Got it.
and it has some shading in gray at the top and then down a few columns. It was updated
Oh, there it is.
January 17th, 2025 at 5:15 p.m.
And so members, so one way in the back is the property tax levy, and we're looking at the aid appropriation summary. Is that correct?
Correct.
Very good. Everyone have it? All right.
Okay.
You got it? Everyone's good? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So looking at this spreadsheet, I'm just going to go through the columns so that you can understand how to read the spreadsheet. So the first column is simply the line number. That's to help navigate the spreadsheet. The second column is the program. This will include the agency, the general program area, and the line item name. The next two columns show the end of session spending, so Minnesota Management and Budget, or MMB, as Mr. Strom mentioned. They produce an end of session spending, not exactly a forecast, but they tally the numbers after the end of the session and create a document showing those. So those numbers are reflective of the end of session in 2024. The next four columns reflect fiscal years 24 through 25. We are currently in fiscal year 2025, as Mr. Strom said. So the fiscal year 2024 column is actual numbers, or shows mostly actual numbers. The fiscal year 25 column is still open, but it's effectively estimates. The 24-25 column is the combination of those two columns. And then the change from EOS, or end of session 24, shows the change from the end of session fiscal year 24-25 column. When you see changes from that column, especially in the education finance world, they are typically related to forecast changes. A number of programs in the education world are forecast programs or entitlement programs, and they are based on the number of pupils often, or formulas that need to be calculated based on the number of pupils or based on enrollment. Sometimes it's different enrollment numbers that they use in different formulas. But effectively, if the number of students change or the data about the students change, those numbers are subject to change. So if you see changes in those highlighted columns, that's why there are changes. The next four columns show fiscal years 26 through 27, and you can read those similarly to how you might have read fiscal years 24 through 25. And then the final three columns show fiscal years 28 through 29. Fiscal years 26 and 27, as Mr. Strom mentioned, are the planning years. So we are currently in fiscal year 25, but in this 2025 session, you are setting the budget for fiscal years 26 and 27. Technically, you do need to balance the budget for fiscal years 26 and 27. You do not technically need to balance the budget for fiscal years 28 and 29. It is highly recommended that you balance the budget for fiscal years 28 and 29. In the finance world, we like to call the fiscal years 28 and 29 the tails, or the out years. So those are still in your budget horizon, your forecast horizon. All right, so that is a brief introduction to the spreadsheet. And now I'm going to go ahead and go through the spreadsheet for K through 12 education. Line 2 begins the general education area. Line 3 shows the formula allowance per pupil. This amount is not in thousands, unlike most of the rest of the spreadsheet. This dollar amount is a per pupil amount that shows the basic aid component of the general education program. The dollar amounts for fiscal year 24 are $7,138, 25, $7,281. Fiscal year 26, $7,448. And I'll note that this is a 2.3% increase from the previous year, which amounts to a $167 increase. Fiscal year 27 is $7,636 per pupil. This is a 2.5% increase from the previous year, or $188. Fiscal year 28 is $7,856, which is a 2.9% increase, or a $221 increase. Fiscal year 29 is $8,013 per pupil, which is a 2% increase, or a $157 increase. All right, lines, as I mentioned, lines 4 and 5 show a similar phenomenon. They show the formula allowance inflationary increase percent and the formula allowance inflationary increase in dollars. In 2023, the legislature passed a law stating that the formula allowance would increase based on inflation tied to inflation with a minimum increase of 2% and a maximum increase of 3%. And so as you can see, those inflationary increases fit within that 2% to 3% range. Let's see. Line 6 shows the general education revenue that is attributable to indexing the formula to inflation, to what I just described. We don't have the numbers broken out for every little appropriation, but we have the lump sum here. And so that is $563.76 million in fiscal years 26 and 27, and $1.366 billion in fiscal years 28 and 29. And line 7 shows the aid shift percentage. So not all items in the education world are funded on a 90%, 10% basis, but some are, and I will attempt to explain what that means. Education's so fun, isn't it, guys? Yeah, okay. So in the education world, as I mentioned, there are entitlement programs. And those entitlement programs are funded on a 90% current year, 10% previous year basis. They do this for a number of reasons, but part of it is because the enrollment numbers, the pupil numbers change considerably. The department doesn't want to be in a situation where they require effectively a refund from the schools. So they pay the schools 90% of the entitlement of what they're entitled to for the current year. And then when they finalize the numbers, they pay the school the final 10% of what they were owed the previous year. This allows them to not overpay the schools and basically allows those numbers to change a decent amount without the schools being required to pay back the Department of Education. There could be a number of other reasons, but that's the main one I know. So, moving on. Line 8 shows the general education base funding. Let's move over to the November forecast now because the end of session forecast was at the end of session. So fiscal years 24 and 25, it has a base of $16.3 billion. Fiscal years 26 and 27, the base is $17 billion. And lines fiscal years 28 and 29, the base has increased to $17.8 billion. Line 10 shows the other general education programs that are not included in the basic, in the general education program. So line 11 shows abatement aid. This receives $3.7 million in fiscal years 24 and 25, $4.2 million in fiscal years 26 and 27, and $4.6 million in fiscal years 28 and 29. Line 12 shows the Area Learning Center transportation aid. This receives $2 million each biennium ongoing. Line 13 shows career and technical aid. This receives $2.6 million in fiscal years 24 and 25, $922,000 in fiscal years 26 and 27, and $618,000 in fiscal years 28 and 29. Line 14 shows the Career and Technical Education Consortium. This receives $10 million per biennium ongoing. Line 15 shows the Career and Technical Education Emergency Medical Services course grants. This receives $1.25 million in fiscal year 24 and 25, and then $1 million per biennium ongoing. Line 16 shows the Career and Technical Education Transportation Pilot Program. This received $450 million in fiscal years 24 and 25, and this was one-time funding. Line 17 shows the Consolidation Transition Aid. This shows $6,000 in funding for fiscal years 24 and 25. As you can see, it doesn't really look like there were many schools that consolidated in the fiscal year 24-25 period. In fiscal years 26 and 27, anticipated aid is $435,000, and 28-29, $450,000. Line 18 shows the English Learner Cross-Subsidy Aid Reduction. This occurred only in fiscal years 22 through 25 only. They received $4 million in fiscal years 24 and 25, and then this funding is not ongoing thereafter. Line 19 shows the Enrollment Options Transportation. This item receives $44,000 in fiscal years 24 and 25, $52,000 in 26 and 27, and $61,000 in fiscal years 28 and 29. Line 20 shows the Non-Public Pupil Education Aid. This receives $45.094 million in fiscal years 24 and 25, $52.522 million in fiscal years 26 and 27, and $56.414 million in fiscal years 28 and 29. On line 21, you can see the non-public pupil transportation aid. This receives $50.177 million in fiscal years '24 and '25, $56.218 million in fiscal years '26 and '27, and $58.437 million in fiscal years '28 and '29.
Mr. Chair, may I ask a question about that? These past line items, 20 and 21?
Representative Dipple, go ahead. DePel, excuse me.
You got it. Non-public pupil education aid, non-public pupil transportation, what does that cover? Is that homeschools, co-ops, anything non-public? It wouldn't be charter because charter's public. What all does that cover?
Ms. Beckel,
Mr. Chair,
or Mr. Strom, sorry.
Representative DePel, one thing for the committee's notice as well, Ms. Beckel and I put together some school finance documentation for you in these booklets each year. And so we'll have, in the school finance booklets, we'll have a detailed explanation of each of these programs. But in answer to your question for the transportation, essentially what happens is, that does not apply to the homeschool, but for the traditional non-public schools, a student who's attending a non-public school is entitled by state statute to the same transportation option provided to public school students. So within a district, if, let's say there's one non-public school within that district, if the school district buses for 2 miles or more to their elementary school, then they would need to provide for the non-public school that same busing. In many districts, there's more than one non-public school, and sometimes those issues can get a little confusing about essentially the equivalent of attendance zones. But for the transportation portion of that, what the school district is given is a mandate to provide that transportation, and then this formula reimburses the school district based on the average transportation spending in that district. So the money goes to the school district to provide the services to the non-public students. There can be arrangements at times that the district and the non-public school will negotiate something separately, but usually the school district provides the transportation through its transportation system, whether that's district operated or operated through contract services with a contract bus company. In terms of the non-public pupil aid, that's a threefold aid that includes health services, textbooks, and secondary guidance services. And the state calculates the average amount that districts spend on each of those three categories and then provides that amount to essentially the non-public students. There's a few exceptions to that, but generally a non-public student is eligible for those reimbursements, and they come through the district. There's a complicated process for the purchase of the textbooks, but essentially, yeah, if the textbook portion of that were, say, $90 per year, then the non-public school could essentially ask the school district to order it $90 per non-public pupil of textbooks each year for that amount. The nursing services are sometimes provided, the health services are sometimes provided by the school nurse. Again, that arrangement varies, and the counseling is provided at the secondary level only. There's a lot of twists and turns in the non-public aid, and I'd be happy to address any specific questions, but that's basically how those aids are calculated and then how those services are provided to the non-public school children.
Thank you.
Follow-up, Representative DePel, you good?
No, I'm good, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Representative Bennett, you came on, then, okay. Representative Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this may be a question more for members who served on Education Finance previously, first time on this committee this term. Do we have any sense of what the previous legislature's intent was in the one-time funding? Is that a cost that's going to go back to the school districts, or was the intent for them to use this money for a purpose that was only needed during this term or this biennium, and then they'll no longer be engaged in those services?
Mr. Strom, you want to take and Representative Hudson, the hard part of that is understanding all the people that put their one-time funding. Those legislators obviously aren't here. So getting their intent, but Mr. Strummer, Ms. Beckel, maybe you can glean from that, listening to the committee, an answer for Representative Hudson. And Representative Hudson, I want to paraphrase again, I want to make sure I get the essence of your question. So what you're asking is, the one-time funding that was passed, to the best knowledge, what was the intent of that? Was it to be established as one-time funding with the hopes of ongoing, or was it to be encapsulated in those years? Is that what you're asking?
Mr. Chair, that'd be an accurate characterization of the question.
Thank you. Mr. Strawn, Ms. Beckel.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hudson, the legislative budget tracking that we'll use does not depend essentially on intent. It depends on how that appropriation was written. So if the legislature creates an aid but only funds that aid for 2 years, that aid goes out to school districts. Once the state transfers it to the school district, it's up to the school district to spend it according to how the statute said that aid was to be done. As Ms. Beckel's spreadsheet shows you, on some of these programs where there's zeros in 26 and 27 for something that was funded in 24 and 25, then essentially from our budget purposes, the way we look at that is that's not expected to be ongoing. The process in this committee, the line item appropriations that are passed, whether they're aid or grant appropriations, will usually contain a sentence that says either this is a one-time appropriation or it will follow the budget rules that it's not. But the tracking will certainly reflect that. And so as a matter of intent, if a legislator may wish to have a program ongoing, the legislature may have only funded that for 2 years. So the intent we don't really get into for a particular legislature, but for the intent of the legislation itself, the executive branch and our offices look at what the legislation said. Did it say it was one-time funding, or did it say it was ongoing? In terms, one other issue on this to think a bit about on grants, if those grants haven't been issued or not all spent, there's a cancellation process for grants. If it's a program for school districts and it's gone out essentially as aid or a grant money to the school district doesn't necessarily need to spend its ongoing aid in the year that it's earned. But the state's control of that money, essentially once it transfers to the school district, goes to the school district, that money doesn't come back to the state unless the state were to essentially recapture that. That's a different process than grants. If grants haven't gone out yet, then the state can treat those separately, or if they're never issued or aren't spent, then those cancel back. But money that goes to school districts as aid programs doesn't act in the same way it goes on to the school district books. I'm not sure if that got at your question or not. We're happy to speak more to that if it's helpful.
And Representative, follow up, otherwise I can add more to that comment.
Well, sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and perhaps I can provide some guidance for your follow-up. I guess, trying to put it into layman's terms, it seems, in looking at the specific example, for instance, of the, excuse me, English learner cross-subsidy reduction aid, my understanding from what I'm hearing is that that funding was provided one time for that specific allocated purpose. It could only be spent for that. And that if that need persists in future bienniums, school districts are gonna have to find the money themselves unless we come up with the budget this year for that line item.
Representative Hudson, yes, and Mr. Strong or Ms. Beckel, feel free to jump in. So let me just lay out what my experience has been in the time that I've been here. One-time funding can happen to an aid or an entitlement, just to boost a program that we think may be lagging. One-time funding can happen to a pilot program. Hey, we think we're gonna try this, and then if it works, the school district's gonna take it from there and figure out how to pay for it in the future. One-time funding could also happen with the clandestine hope of, get me in the budget, and then let's hope, and then I'll really start the sales process down the road. And it can also happen with a legislator or an initiative that we're gonna force it into your school district, and then you're gonna have to deal with it down the road. Those are the varying categories that I have seen. Is there any that I might be missing, Mr. Strom or Ms. Beckel?
Mr. Chair, I think that that's a good encapsulation of the kinds of ways that can go. One other area which this specific line item is related to is that the overall funding for English learners was changed, and essentially there's now a cross subsidy that's a part of that, that on Ms. Beckel's worksheet is all rolled up into line 8. And so there is ongoing funding for cross-subsidy for English learners and a different English learner funding formula in place that's all part of general education revenue. So in this particular example, that's a case where a standalone funding program's now part of the general education formula. And when we look at the components of general education, we'll see the English language learning funding as a part of that. But I think, Mr. Chair, you've captured those ways quite accurately about how one-time funding may or may not have ended up there and what it may or may not mean for future years.
Representative Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I very much appreciate that clarification. It's very helpful information. Goes to show that there are certain nuances which can't be communicated on a spreadsheet. Thank you.
And Representative Hudson, thank you for the question. I would just add, I think that the do no harm, the best we can from this committee is where I operate. I mean, the school districts are going to come to us with problems, things they're facing. And if we can help them in what they're trying to do to their charter of academic achievement, career pathways, whatever they may be, I think we should look at that. I think that, I'm sure Representative Bakeberg is ready to jump in on this because he has to deal with this. It's when, through the process of the policy and the education finance, we put something on their shoulders that they haven't asked for, because they have enough going on. It may be a worthy thing. I mean, you know, maybe it may or may not be worthy, but I think when you put something on, you know, when you put something on their shoulders when they're trying to already offload some things or take care of the problems they have, we can create problems. Okay. Since I mentioned your name, Representative Bakeberg, would you like to allow this can of worms to be shut, or do you want to keep going? I think it's a great question, by the way. I don't mean that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Hudson, for the question. And I think Chair Creasy hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of things that we're gonna go through that you're gonna see, and a lot of allocations that have gone out historically, that frankly, school districts are saying, how is that a priority? So I think just all of these things that we go through, thinking about when we allocate, even if it's, you know, $1 million, you know, it's money that is not being allocated to the school district to be able to make the decisions that best fit their individual district, so.
Thank you, Representative Hudson. Okay. Ms. Becker would like to continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I'll continue on line 22. The one-room schoolhouse receives $130,000 per year per biennium ongoing. Line 23, the pregnant and parenting pupil transportation receives $110,000 per biennium ongoing. Line 24 shows the unemployment aid, which is appropriated for transfer to the special revenue fund. This was a one-time $135 million appropriation in fiscal year '24, and now it is in the special revenue fund. Line 25 shows the Wyndham School District one-time supplemental aid. They used $160,000 of this in fiscal year '24, and the rest canceled in fiscal year '25. The total general education subtotal then is $16.6 billion in fiscal years '24 and '25, $17.2 billion in fiscal years '26 and '27, and about $18 billion in fiscal years '28 and '29. The next section is education excellence. On line 29 is the achievement and integration aid. This receives $166.094 million in fiscal years '24 and '25, $170.149 million in fiscal years '26 and '27, and $168.177 million in fiscal years '28 and '29. Line 30 shows the Alliance of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Latin Americans grant. They received $485,000 in fiscal year '24 and '25 only. It appears they've can't let 15,000 of that cancel. So they received 500,000 initially. Line 31 shows the advanced placement / international baccalaureate exam fees. Those receive 9 million per year or per biennium ongoing. Line 32 shows the advanced placement international baccalaureate STEM course grants. This receives 500,000 per biennium ongoing. Line 33 shows the Building Assets Reducing Risks Center. This received an appropriation of 5 million in fiscal year 24 and 25, and I believe this appropriation is available through the end of fiscal year 2026. Line 34 shows the Civic Education Grants. This is a one-time appropriation of 150,000 in fiscal year 2025 only. Line 35 shows the Charter School Building Lease Aid. This receives 184.915 million in fiscal year 24 and 25, 196.562 million in fiscal years 26 and 27, and 209.335 million in fiscal years 28 and 29.
And Ms. Beckel?
Yes.
I'm gonna offer you a reprieve if you'd like to save your voice. Members, would you like Ms. Beckel to read through each line, or can you read through these and ask her a question on the ones that you'd like to ask a question on?
Number two.
Okay. So, let's just take just 20 seconds here, read through, and Representative Bennett, you have a question?
I do, Mr. Chair, thank you, and actually, thank you for that, because I do have a question about a line, but on, I guess, on any of these lines, and I'll just give an example, number 23, pregnant and parenting pupil transportation. If a district does not use that funding, they don't have the need, they don't have a pregnant and parenting pupil, say at a certain year, can they spend those lines on other things? Or are they only for that purpose and it has to sit somewhere? Or is it dependent upon the line? Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Ms. Beckel, Mr. Strong.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I believe the funds do have to be used for that, but Mr. Strom can provide better detail than I can.
Mr. Chair, Representative Bennett, on this program, it's essentially for transporting kids to and from ALC, the Area Learning Center schools, and it's a cost reimbursement formula. So there's a fixed amount appropriated for it. If districts spend more than that amount, the amount that they'll get in reimbursement is prorated. So the legislature essentially sets that dollar target and says, here's how much money is available for this. Send in your transportation expenses of transporting kids to and from the Area Learning Center that meet this definition. And then they add those all up and say, okay, we got requests for 50% more than what we could offer, so we're gonna reduce the reimbursement for you all. So on that, each of these can be handled in a different way, but on that formula, that's an example where the state sets a total dollar amount and then districts that are interested in the funding apply for reimbursement.
Follow-up?
Mr. Chair, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. Strom. So are most of these lines, not counting the formula and so on, that just goes directly to schools, are most of these on request only when a district basically bills the state? Or are most of them, is the money sent directly to the district? Combination thereof.
Mr. Chair, Representative Bennett, out of the lines on Ms. Beckel's wonderful spreadsheet, about 30 of those lines are formula-driven. The vast majority of the money is formula-driven, and as Ms. Beckel said, that usually is on a per pupil, some measure of student count basis. So on most of the big lines, they're per pupil-driven. On the one you just asked about, there are a number that are cost reimbursed, like the career and technical special education is a partial cost reimbursement formula. Those are two of the very biggest ones, but there's a number of other aid programs that are based on cost. And so there, the legislature may or may not have criteria for a district to be in that program, but it's a cost-based amount. But so in terms of total dollar amount, probably I would guess 70% goes out on a per pupil basis and 25% on a cost basis. And then there's a whole series of smaller programs, as you can see from Ms. Beckel's worksheet, where there may be one-time funding or grant funding for very specific purposes where the money may go out on a very narrow formula where it's not available to all districts, but just available to some who are perhaps in a specialized program or otherwise have met a need that the legislature in the past has said that's important for us to fund. So there can be a whole mix amongst the programs, and I think it's important when there's tons of programs like there is in the K-12 area to keep in mind that the really big ones spend a really large portion of the money, and those are either per pupil or cost-based. But then there's all sorts of examples of little tiny programs that work in one way or another. And,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Strong.
And so, to get us through, we've got 45 minutes left, and so, Mr. Strom, or Ms. Beckel, how far would you like to get through today? You also have Thursday as well, but I just wanna, you've done this enough, so I wanna make sure I know the flow of your time.
Well, Mr. Chair, Ms. Beckel's doing all the work, but let me say that this is a good example of time for you to ask about specific programs and dig into programs you're interested in. Part of what your task is going to be is to decide, do you want to fund everything at the baseline level of funding, or should some programs receive more or less funding? And so it's helpful to know about the line items on the spreadsheet. I think maybe we should move fairly quickly to the levy spreadsheet as well, and we can always come back to this. But the goal is really to make folks comfortable with their, with the materials that they're going to be looking at this session. One other thing that I'd add is that, and I hate to speak on behalf of Ms. Beckel, but part of what Ms. Beckel can do is set up a spreadsheet in a different way as well. So Representative Hudson was asking about funding on one-time basis. It's possible for us to put together a spreadsheet that shows 26, 27 compared to 24, 25, and you can see the programs that don't continue in a column instead of the way we're outlining it here, or you can see the ones where funding is growing. So there are ways for us to use this information to help you better understand the particular budget areas that you're looking at. But I'll leave that for now, but just know that these are resources to help you all as you're going to be making your budgeting decisions this year.
Very well. So, Mr. Strom, Ms. Beckel, here's what I propose. There's 3 items on the education excellence, if you could just cover quickly. Then let's do the READ Act and Department of Education. And then we can move on to the levies, and if there's other questions, we can have those ready for next Thursday. So, literacy incentive aid, paraprofessional paid orientation, and then full-service community schools. So let's talk about those 3, and then let's move to the READ Act. So, literacy incentive aid, if you would.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair and members, I apologize. Moving to line 54, literacy incentive aid. This item receives $81.641 million in fiscal years 24 and 25, $81.506 million in fiscal years 26 and 27, and $80.462 million in fiscal years 28 and 29.
Mr. Chair, could I jump in with one other comment about Ms. Beckel's spreadsheet that's so helpful? On this line, you'll note that literacy incentive aid is underlined. And Ms. Beckel has underlined those programs that are adjusted as a matter of the forecast because of pupil counts. Is that essentially right? And other cost-based changes? Would you like to talk about your underlining?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Strom. So the underline on this spreadsheet actually refers to whether or not this program is shifted. So the programs that are underlined are shifted 90-10, generally speaking, unless it's the special education program, which is shifted on a different percentage. But typically, the programs that are shifted are also based on entitlement, but not all. So in order to complicate things a little further.
All right, excellent. And let's take a couple steps back. Let's go to 48, full-service community.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Line 48, full-service community schools. This receives an appropriation of $15 million in fiscal years 24 and 25, $10 million in fiscal years 26 and 27, and $10 million in fiscal years 28 and 29, and that's ongoing. Every biennium, $10 million.
Very good. And then 67, paraprofessional paid orientation.
Thank you. Line 67 shows paraprofessional paid orientation. This item starts in fiscal year 25 and is funded at $7.23 million in that year. It then is funded in fiscal years 26 and 27 at $16.631 million, and in fiscal years 28 and 29 at $16.876 million.
Very well. Any questions on those? Okay, let's delve into the READ Act. That's new from last session, and I'll let you go there.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. On line 77 is the READ Act. Line 78 through 91 show those appropriations. Lines 78 through, let's see, 84, and then, let's see, yes, I believe show the initial READ Act appropriations. So line 78 shows the appropriation for the Center for Applied Research and Educational Improvement. They received $4.2 million in fiscal years 24 and 25. Line 79 shows the READ Act curriculum and instructional materials. They received $35 million in fiscal years 24 and 25. Line 80 shows the MDE literacy specialist funding. They receive $500,000 per biennium ongoing for this position. Line 81 shows the READ Act professional development funding. This is broken out into 3 separate appropriations. One for administration at the Minnesota Department of Education, one for regional literacy networks, and one for statewide training. In fiscal year 24 and 25, it has a total appropriation of $38.95 million. And then in the following biennia, in fiscal years 26, 27, $15.5 million, and the same in fiscal years 28 and 29, $15.5 million, with the administration funding removed. Line 85 shows the supplemental READ Act funding that begins in fiscal year 25. So this is from the 2024 session. It totals $33.225 million, and the components include the Center for Applied Research and Educational Improvement, paraprofessional and volunteer training at $375,000 in fiscal year 25. Line 87, the culturally responsive materials. This receives $1 million in fiscal year 25. Line 88, the deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing working group. This receives $100,000 in fiscal year 25. Line 89 shows the regional literacy networks, paraprofessional, and volunteer training. That receives $375,000 in fiscal year 25. And then finally, the teacher compensation for READ Act training, which receives $31.375 million in fiscal year 25. And so the READ Act, as a total, receives $111.875 million in fiscal years 24 and 25, and then $16 million each biennium thereafter.
Very good. I just can't help but draw the connections back to your earlier question, Representative Hudson. This is exactly an example where, in a one-time basis, they start up a program. Certainly, looking after literacy and the science of reading, very important. But now, as you look into the outlying years, the question is what's going to happen and how we're going to have to address that. So, and I'm sure there'll be lots of conversations about that, but just thought I would draw that comparison. Mr. Strom, Ms. Beckel, can we jump down to the Department of Education? Lines 180, and you don't have to go through every line, just let's do real top line, you know, what the totals are, and if any members want to specifically ask in a line, we can do that. So lines 189 through 215.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Line 190 is the largest line. This just shows the base education agency budget. In fiscal years 24 and 25, that was 56.625 million. In fiscal years 26 and 27, 55.734 million. And in fiscal years 28 and 29, 56.878 million. I will just draw your attention then to the Board of School Administrators that is housed under the Minnesota Department of Education, and they receive $810,000 every biennium. Happy to go into further detail on any of the
Anybody with further
items within that.
questions? And Mr. Strom and Ms. Beckel, maybe you, it may be too early, but with the re-engineering of some departments, do we know how much was gonna be shifted, or have you started to follow the amount of funding that may be shifting and reallocating with the newly formed department, children, family, and youth? Is that how it, yeah, the DCEF, we're calling it. Did you have it? Just wanna float that one out there, or should we just walk by it?
Yes, Mr. Chair and members.
And maybe as you're looking at that, what I'm really looking for is what was the aid and the programs that went with the Department of Children, Youth, and Families?
Certainly, Mr. Chair and members. So the programs that used to be housed within the Minnesota Department of Education that are now moving to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families include the Early Learning Scholarships, the Educate Parents Partnership, the Grow Your Own Early Childhood Education Program, the Head Start Program, the Parent Child Plus Program, the Quality Rating and Improvement System, and the Reach Out and Read Minnesota Program. Those are items that you do not see on your spreadsheet. Then there are additional items that you will still see on your spreadsheet in the early education or early childhood section, because this committee will retain jurisdiction of those items. That starts on line 159. So the items that have moved to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, but this committee still has jurisdiction over, include developmental screening aid, the administrative funding for developmental screening aid, early childhood family education aid, early childhood family education home visiting aid, early childhood family education support staff, early childhood family education, oh, and then, excuse me, school readiness, and the administration and IT fees for voluntary pre-kindergarten.
Very well. Any questions on that? Which one's first? Representative Mueller? Then we'll go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this. I'm just looking under the Department of Education on lines 213 and 214. And I wasn't on Ed Phi last year, but I was in Ed Poly, and so I'm just, how this is specifically working. I'm seeing we were talking about unemployment aid admin, and apparently that there's decreased funding for that, or is the MDE the one who is actually administering the unemployment aid that we saw previously? And then my other question is, for universal school meals admin, it has this notation that says rolling into base, but if you look in the tails, it's zeros, and so I just wanted an explanation on how I'm supposed to read that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
If you could, let me, and I'm gonna come back to that in a second. I wanna just, the Department of Youth and Family, Representative Reimer, did you have questions specifically to that?
No.
Okay, so let's go ahead and close that one. Is there any other questions on the Department of Children's, Youth, and Family? Okay, now, good. You did, Representative Bakeberg? Then I'll come back to you, Representative Mueller. You're gonna make my head explode, Jim.
So I'm looking at, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at line 215.
But you're jumping to the Department of Ed as well?
But it relates, so, to the Department of Children, Youth,
Okay.
and Families. So I don't wanna make an assumption, but I look at line 215, the department, and then I look at, I don't have my glasses, but, the early childhood, 195, all of those categories, and basically from 195 to 272, they're all zeros. In the forecast. So my question, I guess my fundamental question is, when the Department of Children and Family was lifted up, the FTEs that were at the department, did those all shift to the Department of Children and Families? And then those positions, because the responsibilities shifted to a new department, did those positions shift and stay, or were those positions backfilled? And when I look at line 215, there's an increase from the end of session forecast to the November forecast of basically 91.3. So there's an increase there, and then there's a significant drop. Is that drop because the department reduced staff, because of the opening of Department of Children and Families, or is there another reason for that drop?
Ms. Beckel, Mr. Strong.
Mr. Chair and members, all very good questions. The transition to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families has caused quite the confusion in all this tracking. That is a very good question about the administration. So I believe at the end of session, it was 1.148 million from the Department of Education worth of administrative funding went from the Department of Education to DCYF as well. And that is visible on my Children and Families spreadsheet, which I can provide to this committee as well, showing the shifts. So that was a certain amount of base operating that moved just in a chunk from MDE to DCYF. However, because it wasn't, perfectly per FTE, MDE made a request last session to backfill some of that funding, and that is on line, let's see. No. MDE made a request for additional funding of $173,000 of back funding, and that I have rolled into the base at this point, but that went along with a summer EBT appropriation, and those items last year were not tracked in the House Education Finance Committee. They were tracked in the House Children and Families Committee, despite those appropriations going to the Minnesota Department of Education. So I am showing those appropriations not rolled into the Education Finance Committee in the end of session forecast, as they were shown on the general fund balance from MMB. I am showing them rolled into the spreadsheet in this November forecast. So I'm sure that's very confusing, but that is part of why the number is so high. You can see on line 212, there's that large summer EBT item, and then in the base agency budget, there's a number of things that are rolled up into that, but 173,000 is rolled up into that as just part of the base operating budget because of that request from last year as well. If need be, I can definitely break that out for you. So that's some of the admin agency shifting that happened there. Then I believe the rest was in response to that question, so.
Follow-up, Representative Bickford? Okay, and so members, just as we get into this, we're gonna have a hearing on this. We're gonna be diving deeper into this to try to understand, to help you as well. One question I have, Ms. Beckel, how is it being reported to you now? How is it, the information coming to you to try to figure out on the spreadsheet? Is it coming from each of the departments? Is it put in a blender and then you get whatever comes out? How's this working?
Mr. Chair and members, so I am getting this information from the Minnesota Management and Budget Fund Balance Analysis, and then I am working with the executive budget officers at Minnesota Management and Budget, as well as the finance staff at the Minnesota Department of Education and the Department of Children, Youth, and Families to put this together.
Bravo. It sounds horrible. I'm gonna come back to you. Representative Mueller, now we can come back to your question on the unemployment in the universal schools.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think I figured, at least figured out the unemployment. I really wanted that question about the universal school meals and understanding why it's zeroed out in the tails. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Beckel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Another very good question. I was trying to show that I was attempting, once again, to roll administrative funds into the top line base education agency budget. As you can see, the Department of Education is nearly taking up a whole page. So I was making an attempt to save some space. So effectively, that $404,000 appropriation per biennium, that is still there. It's just that I am subtracting it from the extra line and moving it into the base agency line. And it was a good question about the funding in the unemployment aid admin being higher. Initially, basically, they had funds roll over from 23 into 24, 25, and then they ended up just not using all those funds. I don't know that we will see them use all of the fiscal year 25 funds, so we may see some of those funds cancel. It's unclear at this point. As you can see, they just have 175,000 appropriated per year ongoing in the future. So I don't imagine they need more than 175,000 for this position or for this item per year ongoing, at least at this point. So, and again, those are items, well, and those items I did not roll into the base yet, but I can, or I can take them out.
Nope, I just want, okay, and so, one quick thing, and then I have Representative Reimer and then Representative Quam. Lines 201 and 202, those cancel out. What were those related to again? The IT and the litigation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. These were one-time requests from the agency to update their IT and then for funding to respond to a number of ongoing litigation items.
I'm sorry, Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a similar question about the line 202 about litigation fees. Again, just to be clear, these may have been lawsuits that were filed against the Department of Education, or are these funds also used for individual school districts? What constituted having that large of a litigation cost?
Ms. Beckel?
Mr. Chair and members, so this was just I believe the requested amount from the agency. Ms. Parrott would actually be the expert on exactly the cases that are ongoing. I do know of one ongoing case but I just wrote down the number they told me that they needed for litigation, to be honest.
I'll ask about that later then.
Ms. Para, would you like to weigh in?
Mr. Strom might also have something to say.
Mr. Strong, Ms. Para, which,
Mr. Chair, Representative Reimer, the largest line item is for a suit called the Cruz Guzman lawsuit. And there may be a little tiny bit of money that's being used on other kinds of suits the MDE is facing, but my understanding is that that money essentially is for Cruz Guzman, and the governor's recommendation, which we'll get to at a future hearing, has additional funding for that. I think this is the fourth round of funding for that, but it's carried as a single biennium without a tail, as how it's been carried each of these three times in the past three budget years. But Cruz Guzman is the primary lawsuit that's there. There's not funding for districts through that line item. There's a very small amount of litigation aid that can reimburse districts in certain special ed cases. But that's really the only place where state aid is used. There's also a levy authority that school districts have for judgments. When a judgment is issued against a school district, the school district can exercise its property tax levy to repay that judgment. So those are the cases when school districts can have that, but really out of the line item you're seeing there, that's almost entirely for the Cruz Guzman lawsuit.
Ms. Para, did you have anything to add?
No, Mr. Chair, I think Mr. Strom covered it. If there are questions about the lawsuit, I can answer those.
Follow-up, Representative Reimer. Are you good? Follow-up, are you good?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Representative Quam, did you take yourself, you're good? Okay, all right.
And Mr. Chair, could I say one other thing about the department budget for the line items on there? Usually Ms. Beckel's going to carry an individual line item for a new request or a new item that comes with agency funding. But otherwise, essentially what happens then when you design the budget, this committee will put together a budget for the department, and there will be riders in that budget for specific purposes if the committee so desires. But that's up to the committee to determine whether it's one big chunk of money or whether there should be individual riders for particular programs. And often, the reasons that have led to a rider in a past year on the agency budget will remain for a future year. And sometimes members want to see a particular area where they've put money for a rider to continue. And when we get to the department budget, you'll see the form of that. There are a series right now of about a dozen riders that say X amount is for this specific purpose. So as Ms. Beckel was saying, generally we roll the budget items up into a general budget number for the agency, but those line items in part reflect new programs, or they reflect programs where the legislature has issued a rider to say this specific amount should be for this purpose.
Very good. So, Mr. Strom, Ms. Beckel, thank you. Members, if there's any other questions on that spreadsheet, I would encourage, write those down. We'll bring them into Thursday, or you can email Mr. Strom or Ms. Beckel directly. We have about 18 minutes, Mr. Strom. Enough time for you to cover did you want to go to the levies next?
Mr. Chair, yes, let's go ahead and do that real quick, and then we'll start. Oops, I ahead of myself there. Let's go ahead and go directly to Ms. Beckel's levy worksheet, and we'll go through the basics of that, and then we'll return to the presentation starting on Thursday.
Okay. Ms. Beckel, you're back up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This next spreadsheet is titled Education Finance 2024 November Forecast Property Tax Levy Tracking. In the upper left-hand corner, it was updated January 17th, 2025 at 5:29 p.m. All right, so this next spreadsheet looks somewhat similar, but shows just the property taxes side of things. It does not show state aid, but rather the levies. It also has line numbers, the program, and then it just has the fiscal years, but you will notice that it also has pay years. So those represent the years in which the taxes were actually paid. So I'm going to focus on fiscal year 2025, the year we are currently in. And then underneath that, it says pay 2024. So school districts recognize the taxes for 2024 in fiscal year 2025. Okay, so the taxes that property owners paid last year in 2024 are being recognized in fiscal year 2025. Clear enough? Okay. There are a great deal of levies, a variety of different types of levies. As you look through this sheet, you may notice there are swimming pool levies, ice arena levies, and tree growth levies, but those are not the biggest levies out there. One of the biggest levies that is available is the local optional levy. So that's the one on line 2. You can see that for fiscal year 2025, this was $556.666 million. And these numbers, it's important to note, are in entitlements and not in appropriations. So these numbers are not shifted like the numbers that we saw on the appropriation aid spreadsheet. These are just.
And Ms. Beckel, if you could
Yes.
just, for the committee, define entitlement versus appropriation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so entitlement, again, is the total calculated amount that a district is owed for the, number of students, et cetera, that is put into the formula, the total amount of aid that the district is owed. The appropriation then is that entitlement times 90%, and then they get 10% of the previous year's entitlement. So that's why we call it 90-10.
Very good.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. So again, the levies spreadsheet is in entitlements and not appropriations. Another quite large levy is the operating capital levy. This one, in 2024 cost taxpayers $106.859 million. And those were both general education program levies. Let's see. Line 8 shows the referendum levy. So, pretty common one. This is the one that people vote on. So this is $915.672 million. Line 9 shows the alternative compensation or Q-comp levy. Not quite as large as the others, but still $39.5 million worth. Again, this is across the state of Minnesota, so large totals still. Lines 28 and 29 show the long-term facilities equalized levy and the long-term facilities unequalized levy. These are $78.5 million roughly and $232.5 million roughly each. And those are also pretty significant levies. And you can look at the facilities section of my appropriations spreadsheet to see the aid appropriation that it matches up with.
So members, this is, if you want to ask about a specific levy and how it comes into the spreadsheet, now might be a good time, or we can continue to let you go. Questions? This is the fun part of the day. Okay, Ms. Beckel?
Okay. I'm gonna jump down to line 61. So this is in the Community Service Fund. There's a number of different funds. There's the General Education one, the Community Service Fund, Debt Service. So this one is basic community education. This also lines up with an appropriation, an aid appropriation on my typical aid appropriation spreadsheet. So this is $38.697 million in fiscal year 2025, pay 24. Line 80, you can see the debt service fund. This has quite a few items that all add up together to make the debt service levy. Lines 81, 82, and 85 all total together to make the total state debt service levy, and then lines 83, 84, and 86 are subtracted out of that to get the final net debt service number. And let's see, then line 108, you can see the other post-employment benefits or pension debt service fund with a number of levies involved in there. Any interest in those levies?
Any questions?
Then otherwise, we will jump down to line 126 with the credits. There are two rather large credits by themselves, the school building bond agricultural credit, and then the market value agriculture credit that reduce the levies by a decent amount. And then there's a number of other credits that added together reduce the levies by a significant amount as well, including disparity reduction aid, border city aid, or credits, Monoman, local optional revenue disaster abatement aid, disaster credits, prior year credits, et cetera. And that brings us down to our total certified levies after credits, which for fiscal year 25, pay 24, totaled about $3.9 billion.
Okay. Any quick questions? Otherwise, I've got a couple of clarifying things and I'll throw out. So when I first came in, a couple of things, if you could just explain the terms and the interactions, I would hear this term as, oh, we're gonna get a zero target levy. What does that mean? Our interaction with taxes, how this goes. And then the third one is with the unemployment insurance and wherever that runs out, what that could possibly mean for levy targets down the road, or how schools may use levies to pay for that. So those three areas are ones that I've commonly heard that I just thought maybe you could help us clear up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so the first item, as long as I've been here, both the House and Senate have had a zero levy target. So that means that if there are policies enacted that would impact the levies, so increase property taxes, for example, then the legislature would need to neutralize those levy impacts, AKA it would need to buy down those levy impacts. So part of the appropriation target, if there was a target for the appropriations, that committee would have to use part of that appropriation target to buy down the levy. Say the levy had an impact of $5 million, well, the committee would use the appropriation target, say $5 million. It would adjust some of the levies on the levy spreadsheet by, say, adjusting maybe local optional revenue or operating capital revenue, depending on if it was levied over referendum market value or adjusted net tax capacity, and then basically even out the effect so that the levies would still, the change to the levies would still be zero. So that's what a zero levy target means. Then,
Our relation to taxes.
Yes. Mr. Chair, perhaps Mr. Strom could
Mr. Strom?
handle that one.
Mr. Chair, this committee deals with a fair portion of the school levies. When we look at the remaining charts on Thursday, you'll see the school levies are one of the biggest forms of levies in the state. About a little under a third of the total levy, property tax levy in the state goes to school districts. The tax committee will work on issues that involve the composition of the tax base. It often helps this committee with tax credits, and sometimes it even goes so far as to make equalization changes or make other tax changes to school funding programs. The best way this can go is for the members of this committee to be in close contact with their tax counterparts, so that you don't surprise each other on what you're doing. And while we have an informal levy target, as Ms. Beckel said, the tax committee operates under a slightly different model in terms of how they count their property tax impact. But for this purpose, the really key takeaway is that if this year is like other years, you'll have a zero increase over base allowed for the property tax situations that you face. So even if a district has a very good idea and says we want to pay for that ourselves through a local property tax levy, that levy is essentially something you're going to have to track and pay for on your books. In terms of the unemployment insurance, just very quickly on that, there is an ongoing levy for unemployment insurance that has been in place for more than 40 years. That levy does not cover the hourly workers. That covers essentially the full-time layoffs of employees, but not the summer hourly workers. If a para were laid off during the school year or otherwise laid off, but not for the summer break, that funding would be, that amount would be rolled in there, but the para funding for the summers is in a separate fund, and if the funding there is not renewed and that funding goes away, the portion of that that's not covered by special ed will essentially be out of the district's general budget, will not roll over to the district's property tax levy amount for unemployment insurance.
And Mr. Strom, if you could just take that another step further, thank you for that. School districts have enjoyed a special relationship with unemployment insurance. If you could just explain that and how that has changed.
Mr. Chair, if I'm understanding you correctly, school districts are a reimbursable employer, and so they don't pay the tax rate that private employers pay. Instead, they're pay the amount essentially that their employees take out of the system. So they're called a reimbursable employer. And so that means that they're not experience rated, but instead whatever eligible charges of unemployment have gone into the system from the district then is required to pay that amount, not based on anything but its own costs, and then that amount rolls to the levy for the non-summer unemployment of the paras. For the summer hourly workers, which are primarily paras but can be bus drivers and others, that was a newly created category of eligible employees. The state essentially the legislature set up a fund that districts apply to reimburse their expenses to that, but those expenses are paid in the same way to the unemployment insurance fund by the district through their actual costs, not through a tax rate.
Very good. We have about 4 minutes. Any quick questions? Otherwise, I can give you the wrap-up. Okay. So, well, thanks. This is a lot. Again, try to digest it. I recommend putting this in your save folder. We'll need this again. And, what's that? So just go ahead and stick it back in your folders, and then we'll make sure it gets put back in. So members, with that, we're gonna conclude the meeting. We'll be meeting again Thursday, the 23rd, same time, same place. And so with that, we stand adjourned.